Okay, let's proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Before I begin, may I ask that all remaining time up to 5 minutes be reserved for my rebuttal argument?
You may.
Your Honor, please the court.
It does.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, ladies and gentlemen of this jury, I kept shooting until I was sure he stopped moving. Words of a killer. Those are the words of the defendant after he took the life of a man who had no weapon, who posed no threat to anyone or had ever harmed a single individual, Dwayne Lay. Members of the jury, today we have to talk about the actions of this defendant. But before we do that, I want to take just a brief moment to remember the life that he took. Dwayne Lay, 39 years old. This was a loving husband to Miss Tina Lay, a loving friend, but most importantly, this was a human being. Someone with hopes, dreams, trials and tribulations, just like anyone in this room. But on October 31st, 2014, all the defendant saw, all he saw when he looked at Mr. Lay was a thug. Members of the jury, it seems almost as though every time we turn on our television, we hear about another police officer killing an unarmed victim, and then it's followed up with some reasoning or some justification as to why that victim deserved to die. And that's exactly what the defense came before you today and attempted to do once again. On October 31st, 2014, Mr. Lay went to a Halloween party, and just like everyone else inside that party, he decided to wear a costume. He was enjoying himself with his friends, laughing, making memories. But all that changed in a matter of seconds when the defendant burst inside that room and began shooting, emptying his 9mm clip until he killed Mr. Lay. 1 shot, 2 shots. Mr. Lay is shot in the chest. 3 shots. He shot again in the shoulder. 4 shots. 5 shots. He begins trying to run for his life and he's shot in the back. 6 shots. 7 shots. He shot again in the back and then boom. 9 shots. Last one, the defendant puts a bullet right in the back of his head. Because as he told you, he kept shooting him until he was sure he stopped moving. Members of the jury, as the plaintiff, it was our job today to prove to you one of the things, by preponderance of the evidence, that the defendant acted negligently that night. And but for his actions, Mr. Lay would still be here today. Now, when you go back into that room to deliberate, you'll be instructed that someone is negligent when they do something that a reasonably prudent person would not do under the circumstances. So what we have to focus on are what were the circumstances that night when the defendant killed Mr. Lay. Now, Ms. Renee Citron, she took this stand earlier today. She told you that because it was Halloween, she threw a party. People were wearing costumes. And in addition to it being a party, it was also a casting party for actors and TV shows. Now, ask yourselves, as a reasonable person, on Halloween, would you expect people to be wearing costumes? Would you expect actors to be wearing costumes? And the answer is yes. The defendant told you that when he took that stand today, he told you that when he received that phone call, nobody had told him anything about there being a threat at that house, any criminal activity, any danger whatsoever. All he was told was noise, shut the party down. That's it. That's all he had to do. He had one job, and he failed to do it. He told you that when he arrived in that scene, he saw people in costumes. He told you that he saw a gorilla, didn't think that was real. He saw a ballerina, believed that was a costume, but when he saw Mr. Lay, he thought thug. Without Mr. Lay ever saying a word, hurting anyone, or committing any crime, the defendant prejudiced him, profiled him and targeted him, and perceived him to be a threat. That alone, members of the jury, is not reasonable. Mr. Trone told you that they were inside that room, and then he busted inside that room and began shooting Mr. Lay in the chest, back, and head until he killed him. Now, there's nothing reasonable, there's nothing prudent about the defendant breaking inside a costume party and shooting a man until he kills him when there's been no apparent threat, no reported threat, and nobody is harming anyone. There's nothing reasonable or prudent about that. But you see, the defense, they kept coming before you today and saying that he had no choice. He did what he was trained to do. He had to kill him because he feared for his life and everyone else is in that room. Now, members of the jury, recall what we heard from Dr. Kornblum. Dr. Kornblum told us that the defendant shot him 5 times. 3 of those shots were to the back. And you learn that stippling occurs on a wound when you're shot from close range, when you're shot from within 2 feet. Members of the jury, right now, I'm within 2 feet of you. This is how close the defendant was when he put the bullet in the back of Mr. Lay's head. This isn't acting as if someone is afraid for their life, members of the jury. That's because the defendant was never afraid for his life. He never feared for his life or anyone else's life. And that's because Mr. Lay never did anything wrong that night but wear a costume. And the defendant didn't like how he looked. There's nothing reasonable or prudent about that. But what we also had to show you was that the department is liable for the defendant's actions because they had advanced knowledge that the defendant acted in this reckless, in this dangerous manner, in this disregard for the safety of others. You learn that when he first was put on the force, a lady took out a screwdriver and he took out his gun. I ain't trying to tell you because she was a heavy-set lady, he had no choice. Members of the jury, he looks pretty fit. He looks like he works out and lift weights, and he told you that his only option that day was to pull out a gun. And by him doing that, that caused this woman to die. And what did the police department do? They didn't put him on probation. They didn't fire him. They said, go on, get back out there. You did a good job. And now look where we are today. And what did they do after he killed Miss Tina Lay's husband? They promoted him. They paid this man. They gave him more money. That's what they did. Members of the jury, it's tiring, it's frustrating, and it's heartbreaking that this happens time and time again. Too often the police, the people who are supposed to protect and serve us, are out there killing and harming the exact same people over and over again who are unarmed victims. And we hear it all the time. Tamir Rice, Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, Rakia Boyd, Sandra Bland. Members of the jury, this list goes on and on and on. But the worst part about it is that this defendant just added another name to that list. Dwayne Lay. Members of the jury, one thing is for sure that night. Dwayne Lay didn't lose his life. It was taken from him. It was stripped. It was stolen from him. And no matter what they tell you, no matter how they try to tell you he deserved to die because of his actions, the fact remains he did nothing wrong. He wore a costume. Now, who's to protect us from the police when they act recklessly, when they shoot recklessly, when they kill innocent people? Who's to protect us from them? That answer is you. Right here. Right now, members of the jury. Because nothing Mr. Lay did that night justified this defendant putting 5 bullets in his body until he killed him. Nothing. Find them liable. Thank you.